The morning after a wedding, before the frost had even lifted off the fields, there was a thing a young husband had to do. He had to come and find me, not his father, not the deacon, me. He would walk up the lane with his hat in his hands, and he would stand in my kitchen, and he would tell me, quietly, with his eyes on the floorboards, that the marriage had been made complete, that what was supposed to happen on that first night had happened. And I would nod, and I would write something in a book that no one outside that kitchen ever saw, and then he would go home to his new wife, and neither of us would speak of it again. I did this for 31 years. I sat across the table from more frightened young men than I can count, and I asked them the question a bishop is supposed to ask, and I wrote down their answer, and I told myself I was doing the work of God. I want to tell you about the last time I did it. Because the last time I came home and I sat in the dark, and for the first time in 3 decades I wept. Before I go any further, let me tell you who I am. I was a bishop in an old order Amish community for most of my adult life. I held the authority. I made the rules bend or hold. I decided who was in and who was put out. The women who have told you their stories, the ones who lay awake in the dark, the ones who suffered in silence, the ones who left, most of what you've heard from them is true. I know because I was the man on the other side of it. If you want to understand what this world looks like from inside the seat of power and not just from under its weight, then stay with me. Subscribe, tap the like button, and tell me in the comments. Do you think a man who enforces a thing he doesn't fully understand is guilty, or is he a prisoner too? I read every answer. Let me explain what the confirmation actually was, because I know how it sounds to you now. In my community, marriage was not truly a marriage until it was consummated. That is old church teaching, older than the Amish, older than America. A wedding was a promise. The wedding night was the seal on the promise. And in a community that governs every inch of a person's life, what they wear, how they cut their hair, whether a buggy may have a windshield, it was unthinkable that the most important night of a young couple's life would go unwitnessed by the church. So the bishop stood in for the church, not in the room, never in the room. But the morning after, the husband came and confirmed that the seal had been set, that the marriage was, in the old word, vollzogen, completed, made real. He didn't have to say much. He didn't have to describe anything. That would have been immodest, and modesty was everything. He only had to say that it was done, and I only had to believe him and mark the book. That was the whole of it. A sentence, a nod, a pen scratching across a page. And with those small motions, a girl became a wife in the eyes of God and the eyes of the church, and there was no undoing it after that. Now I know what you are thinking. You are thinking, why would a grown man tell another man such a thing at all? Why not leave it between the husband and his wife, where a thing like that belongs? And the answer is the answer to almost everything in that world. It belonged to the church because everything belonged to the church. A man there does not own his own privacy. He does not own his own beard or his own hat brim or the color of his own buggy. He does not own the inside of his own marriage. The community owns all of it, and the bishop is the hand the community reaches out with. There were different ways of doing it, community to community. In some church districts, the confirmation was folded into an ordinary visit, so that the young man would come by on some pretext to return a borrowed tool, to talk about the plowing, and the words would pass between us almost sideways, the way all the hardest words in that world passed. In others, it was more formal, a set thing on a set morning. In mine, it was the lane and the kitchen and the coffee, and it was understood by everyone what the visit was for, though it was never announced. His mother knew, his father knew, my wife knew, and made herself scarce in the other room. The whole of it happened in a kind of loud silence that everyone could hear and no one would name. And you have to understand what was riding on it. If a young husband could not, in the end, confirm that the marriage was complete, if something had gone wrong, if the couple could not, for whatever reason, make the seal, then that was a matter the church would eventually have to take up, quietly, carefully. But it would be taken up. A marriage that could not be completed was a crack in the foundation of the whole community, because the community was built on families, and families were built on that first night going the way it was supposed to go. So the pen in my hand was not a small thing. It was the church confirming that another brick had been set true in the wall. That is how I thought of it then. A brick set true. Most of what you've heard about this world comes from the women who left, and every word of it is true. But there's another side, the men who were handed the rules and told to enforce them. I was one of those men for 31 years, and the things I held the deepest, the things a man in my position was never permitted to say out loud, I couldn't fit into a video. So I wrote them down. A book called The Weight a Man is Given. The link is in the first comment and the description, and I'll tell you more before the end. For now, stay with me. Let me tell you how a man becomes the one who holds the pen. You are not chosen for it because you want it. That is the first thing outsiders never understand. In my community, a bishop was chosen by lot. The men of the church would nominate, and then the candidates would each take a hymn book from a shelf, and inside one of those books was a slip of paper, and the man who drew the slip was bishop for life. There was no campaign, there was no ambition allowed, you could not want it, and if you did want it, you learned very quickly never to let it show. I drew the slip when I was 34 years old. I remember my hands going cold. I remember my wife's face across the room, not proud, not happy, afraid, because she understood before I did what it would cost us. A bishop belongs to the church first and his family second, and everyone in that room knew it, and she knew it most of all. I remember walking home that day. It was March, the road still half mud, and I walked the whole way instead of taking the buggy because I needed the time. I kept thinking there had been a mistake, that someone would come running after me to say the lot had been read wrong. But no one came. By the time I reached my own gate, I was a bishop, and I would be a bishop until I died or was put out, and there was no slip you could draw to undo that one. From that day, I was the one who confirmed the marriages. I was the one who decided when a young man's beard had grown enough, when a woman's covering was too small, when a family had drifted and needed to be called back. I was the one who set the ordning for our district, who ruled on whether the young men could have that small forbidden thing they always wanted, a battery on the buggy, a cell phone in the barn for business. I sat in judgment on quarrels between brothers, on debts, on a man who drank, on a woman whose dress was 2 inches too short and whose mother wept when I said so. And I was the one who, twice in my years, had to pronounce the ban, the shunning, on people I had baptized with my own hands. Do you know what the ban is truly? It is not just that a person is asked to leave. It is that the whole community is forbidden to eat at the same table with them. A mother may not take a dish from her shunned son's hand. A wife, in the strictest reading, must draw back from her own husband. It is a living death, performed on someone who is still standing in front of you, and it is done in the name of love. To bring them back, we always said, to save their soul. I pronounced that twice. I watched a family split down the middle at my word, and I went home and slept because I believed I was faithful. I want you to understand something because it matters for everything that comes after. I did not think of myself as cruel. I thought of myself as faithful. There is a difference between those two things, and it took me 31 years and one terrible morning to learn what it was. The confirmations were the part of my office I told myself I was good at. I was gentle with the young men. I knew they were terrified. Most of them knew even less than their brides did about what the night was supposed to hold, and they came to my kitchen pale and stammering, and I would put a cup of coffee in front of them and let them find their words. I thought this made me kind. I remember one boy, he could not have been more than 19, who sat across from me and could not get the sentence out. He tried 3 times, and finally he just nodded, one small motion of his head, and looked at the table, and I saw his hands were shaking around the coffee cup. And I marked the book, and I let him go, and I felt something I did not have a word for then. I have the word now. The word is shame, not his, mine. There was an old minister in a district near ours, a man I respected more than almost anyone, who had held his office even longer than I held mine. Near the end of his life, I sat with him on his porch, and he said a thing to me I did not understand then and cannot forget now. He said, "We spend our whole lives making sure the fences are straight, and we never once walk out into the field to see what we fenced in." He was dying when he said it. I think he had walked out into that field at last in his own mind and had seen, and it had frightened him. I nodded like I understood. I did not understand. I would not understand for years yet. But I have thought about that old man on that porch more times than I can count, because he was trying to tell me the one thing our whole office was built to keep us from ever seeing, because I never once asked the other question. In 31 years of confirming that these marriages had been made complete, I never once asked whether the girl was all right, whether she had been frightened, whether anyone had told her a single thing about what would happen to her body in that dark room. The book had a line for the husband's confirmation. It had no line for her at all, and I never thought to add one. There's a part of this I can't get to here in the few minutes a video gives me, so I wrote it down instead, slowly, without the softening every algorithm asks for. It's the weight a man is given. 10 chapters, each one built around a single thing a man like me carries. An anvil, a black ledger, a lantern at the end of a lane, and what each one really costs the people I love. It's the confession of a man who held the authority and mistook the control for love. The link is in the first comment and the description. That's where the part I couldn't say out loud lives. Now let me tell you about the last one. She was the daughter of a family I had known my whole life. I had baptized her. I had watched her grow from a small girl who hid behind her mother's skirts into a young woman who could quiet a whole table of children with one look. She was married in the late fall on a Thursday after the harvest, the way it was always done. 300 people in her father's barn. I preached the sermon myself. I spoke about submission, about the wife yielding, about the godly household. The same words I had spoken over 100 weddings. I believed them when I said them. I want to be honest with you about that. I believed every word. The next morning, her husband came up my lane with his hat in his hands. He was a good boy. I knew his people. And he stood in my kitchen, and he could not look at me, and when I asked him the question, he said, yes, it was done. The marriage was complete. And then he did something none of the others had ever done. He stayed. He did not leave. He stood there turning his hat around and around in his hands, and finally he said very quietly, is she supposed to be... And he stopped. And then he said, I think I hurt her. I didn't know. Nobody told me anything, and I think I hurt her, and I don't know what I was supposed to do. And I stood in my own kitchen, a man who had confirmed 100 of these marriages, and I realized I had no answer for him. I had never had an answer for any of them. I had spent 31 years marking a book, and I had never once been able to tell a single frightened young man how not to hurt the girl he loved, because no one had ever told me, and I had never once asked. I told him to be gentle. That is all I had. 3 words, be gentle with her. And I marked the book, and I let him go home to that girl I had baptized, and I sat down at my table after he left, and the coffee went cold in front of me, and I put my face in my hands. I thought about her. I thought about my own wife 30-some years before, and the things we had not known, and the silence we had called holiness. I thought about every young man who had shaken across that table from me, and every girl on the other end of every confirmation I had ever marked, girls who had no one come up any lane to ask if they were all right. And I understood finally, sitting there in the cold light, what I had actually been the keeper of. Not the sanctity of marriage, the silence. I had been the keeper of the silence. My whole office, the pen and the book and the lot I had drawn at 34, all of it existed to make certain the seal was set, and never once to make certain the person underneath it was not being broken. That is when I wept. A grown man, a bishop, at his own kitchen table, weeping for a thing he had done 100 times, and called it faithfulness. I do not remember how long I sat there. The lamp burned down. My wife came into the doorway at some point and saw me and did not come closer, because in all our years together she had never once seen me weep, and she did not have the words for it any more than I did. She stood there a moment, and then she went back out and let me have it alone. That too was the silence. Even then, even between us. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy for you to hear all this and think I am telling you these were bad people. They were not. The boy who stayed in my kitchen and admitted he was afraid he had done harm. That boy was braver than I had been in 31 years. His fear was the most honest thing I had seen in my office in a decade. The families were not cruel. My wife was not cruel. I was not, I think, a cruel man. We were faithful to a system that had never once asked whether faithfulness and love were the same thing, and had punished anyone who dared to wonder out loud whether they were not. That community gave me things I will carry until I die. It gave me a people who would raise a barn for a stranger in a single day. It gave me a wife who stood beside me through every hard year. It gave me work with my hands and a faith that, wounded as it is still real to me. I will not stand here and tell you it was all darkness. It was not. But there is no scripture that makes a girl's pain holy. There is no teaching that requires her comfort to be the one thing in the whole ordnung that goes unwritten and unspoken and unasked after. I held the pen for 31 years, and the pen only ever wrote down half of what happened in those marriages. The half that belonged to the men, the half that belonged to me, I left, in the end. I'm an old man now, and leaving cost me nearly everyone. There are letters I have written that come back unopened. There is a phone that does not ring on the days it used to ring. The ban I once pronounced on others was pronounced in time on me. And I have learned from the inside what I once handed down from above. I do not ask you to feel sorry for me for that. I marked the book that made that punishment possible. I only tell you so you understand that a man can be both the one who builds the cage and the one who ends up inside it. If you grew up in a place where the people in authority mistook their control for care, I see you. If you were ever the one asked to enforce a rule you did not understand on people you loved until you could no longer feel the difference between the two, I see you too. And if you were the girl on the far end of a confirmation no one ever wrote your name into, I am sorry. It should have been the first line in the book. It was never any line at all. If you want the rest, the full account from a man still standing inside the thing he's describing, not at the end of it. It's all in the weight a man is given. Links in the first comment and the description. 240 pages of what I was never allowed to set down anywhere else. Open the drawer with me. Until next time, light the fire, but don't forget to speak.